Hello guys, welcome to one new edition of React Today as part of the World's Wild Project. Today we're going to speak a little bit about issues that affect our world, that affect Canada and the first world countries. A few weeks ago, if you have followed what's going on in Ukraine, what's in the war against Russia, you might say, no, the war is against Ukraine. Of course it is against Ukraine. Till the last man, will be here till the end, says Nancy Pelosi when she visited President Volodymyr Zelensky. Yeah, it's a lot of things to say. In this program today, we're going to speak a little bit about the declaration of Amnesty International, which was very criticized by Canada, European, NATO governments all around the world as being misguided and irresponsible. We will see what they say about Amnesty International. Just because Amnesty International criticized Ukraine and the way it's conducting the war against their own people. And how? Welcome. Let's begin. What is Amnesty International? We need to define what is Amnesty International for you to understand why we're going to talk about this today. Amnesty International is a global movement of more than 10 million people who take injustice personally. We are campaigning for a world where human rights are enjoyed by all. We are funded by members and people like you. We are independent of any political ideology, economic interest, or religion. No government is beyond scrutiny. No situation is beyond hope. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Few will have predicted when we started that tortures will become international outlaws, that most countries would abolish death penalty, and seemingly untouchable dictators will be made to answer for their crimes. That includes all of them. That includes European, Canadian, North American, even though they don't recognize Amnesty International or the International Court of Justice or any other jurisdictional, international jurisdictional or that has capability like it was the case in the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. The United States, some other countries don't recognize the International Court of Justice. They will do the same with Amnesty International. Back to the point. What does Amnesty do? We investigate and expose the facts whenever or wherever abuses happen. We lobby governments and other powerful groups, such as companies, making sure they keep their promises and respect international law. By telling the powerful stories of the people we work with, we mobilize millions of supporters around the world to campaign for change and to stand in defense of activists on the front line. We support people to claim their rights through education and training. In 1961, British lawyer Peter Benenson was outraged when two Portuguese students were jailed just for raising a toast to freedom. He wrote an article in the Observer newspaper and launched a campaign that provoked an incredible response. Reprinted in newspapers across the world, his call to action sparked the idea that people anywhere can unite in solidarity for justice and freedom. This inspiring moment didn't just give birth to an extraordinary movement. It was the start of extraordinary social change. I quote, "Only when the last prisoner of conscience has been freed, when the last torture chamber has been closed, when the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a reality for the world's people, will our work be done," unquote. Peter Benenson, Amnesty International founder. That's perfect for Julian Assange. Amnesty evolves. Over the years, human rights have moved from the fringes to center stage in world affairs. Amnesty has grown from seeking the release of political prisoners to upholding the whole spectrum of human rights. Our work protects and empowers people from abolishing the death penalty to protecting sexual and reproductive rights, and from combating discrimination to defending refugees and migrants' rights. We speak out for anyone and everyone whose freedom and dignity are under threat. After more than 50 years of groundbreaking achievements, Amnesty has been through a major transformation, adopting two dramatic changes in the world. We have shifted from a large London base to open regional offices in cities in Africa, Asia Pacific, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Middle East. These offices are major hubs for our investigations, campaigns and communications. The new regional offices strengthen the work of sections who already work at the national level in more than 70 countries. We can now respond quickly to events wherever they happen and be a powerful force for freedom and justice. To stay one step ahead, we are also developing tools using the latest technologies such as a mobile phone app that acts as a personal panic button for activists at daily risk of being arrested or detained or killed. I may add that. Like is the case in Colombia, Venezuela, Central South America. Imagine what we can do, continues the document. Imagine what we can do, what we can now achieve standing side by side with activists in every corner of the globe. How many more prisons doors will open? How many more torturers will be brought to justice? How many more people will realize their rights and live in dignity? Okay, so this is just one of the aspects. This is what Amnesty International stands for. But let's go to other aspects of Amnesty International, and that is what they do. We already saw what they are. What we do. Through our detailed research and determined campaigning, we help fight abuses of human rights worldwide. We bring torturers to justice, change oppressive laws, and free people jailed just for voicing their opinion. It hasn't happened with Julian, but pretty soon I hope. Among other things, Amnesty International intervenes in armed conflicts or act to secure that the human rights and civil rights are sustained in armed conflict, in arms control, in child rights, in climate change, in corporate accountability, in death penalties, in detention, in disappearances, in discrimination, in freedom of expression, in indigenous peoples and international justice, in living in dignity, in police violence, refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, sexual and reproductive rights, torture, in the United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This happens through research. Human rights change starts with the facts. Our experts do accurate cross-checking research into human rights violations by governments and others worldwide. Advocacy and lobbying. We use our analysis to influence and press governments, companies, and decision makers to do the right thing. And the term will be campaigns and action. Through petitions, letters and protests, campaigners worldwide press for actions from the people and institutions who can make change happen. With this little opening, I want to talk about the countries. From A to Z of countries and regions. Okay, so we can go from A to C, and they're in Afghanistan, Angola, Austria with the letter A, Albania, Argentina, Azerbaijan, Algeria, Armenia, Andorra, and Austria. Amnesty International cover Africa, Americas, Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. That includes East Africa in Africa, East Africa, the Horn and Great Lakes, South Africa, West and Central Africa. In the Americas, Central America and the Caribbean, North America, South America. In Asia and the Pacific, East Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Europe and Central Asia, Middle East and North Africa. Okay. So, you can find that Amnesty International works in Yemen, Houthis should urgently open Taiz Road. Joint statement, Saudi authorities must release women's rights activist Salma al-Shehab. In Iran, stop ruthless attacks on persecuted Baha'i religious minority. In ensure protection of Saiful Arakani and his family in Bangladesh. And of course Ukraine. Ukraine, two dots. Russian sham trials of prisoners of war in Mariupol illegal and unacceptable. We will going to talk about, of course, the most important this time, which is, of course, the war against Ukraine. or the special operation as has been called by the Russians. And this is very important because we're going to go to armed conflict. Is one of the aspects we already explained here. Armed conflict. Okay, Amnesty International, armed conflict. Overview. Armed conflicts, wars, continue to cause death, displacement, and suffering on a massive scale. Numerous armed conflicts are currently taking place around the world, including those involving warring parties within a single state, non-international armed conflicts, and those involving armed forces from two or more states, international armed conflicts. In 2016, armed conflicts killed more than 100,000 people. Countless survivors were maimed, tortured, raped, forcibly displaced, or otherwise seriously abused. By the end of 2016, 65 million people around the world remained displaced by armed conflict, the largest number ever recorded. Amnesty International documents and campaigns against violations of international law during armed conflicts, regardless of who the perpetrator is or where the abuse occurs. Amnesty supports survivors such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, which the United States doesn't abide to, and some other countries that are part of NATO. Okay, Amnesty International conducts on-site and remote investigations into violations of international law during armed conflicts. Amnesty International researchers spend thousands of hours each year on the ground in conflict-affected areas, interviewing witnesses and survivors, and gathering information from a wide range of local organizations and officials, including military and law enforcement. Amnesty International arms and military advisors identify weapons and munitions and analyze their effects. Besides reporting directly from conflict zones, Amnesty International employs a variety of cutting-edge remote sensing techniques, including the analysis of satellite imagery, as well as verification of available digital evidence, such as videos and photographs uploaded by witnesses, to monitor armed conflicts around the world. Together, the testimonial and photographic evidence collected in the field and the data and imagery gathered remotely provide the factual basis for Amnesty International's global advocacy and campaigns. Amnesty International conducts high-level advocacy and grassroots campaigns dedicated to protect civilians in conflicts and supporting survivors' demands for justice, especially through supporting the work of domestic courts, hybrid courts, and the ICC, that is the International Court. The International Criminal Court, I correct. Okay, that is why I can carry on what the law says. I'm not going to make such a big program today. What the law says. Armed conflicts are governed principally by international humanitarian law, IHL, which is also known as the laws of war. IHL is a set of rules either codified in treaties or recognized through custom that limits the permissible behavior of parties to a conflict. Serious violations of IHL, international humanitarian law, serious violations of IHL are war crimes. The primary aims of IHL are to minimize human suffering and to protect the civilian population and those former combatants who are no longer directly participating in hostilities, such as prisoners of war. IHL demands that parties to a conflict distinguish between civilians who are afforded protection and combatants who are legitimate targets of attack. Civilians may not be deliberately targeted, although they may still be killed or injured if this happens as part of a proportionate attack on a military target. All parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects such as residential buildings, schools and hospitals, disproportionate, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants or which cause disproportionate harm to civilians. is very clear. All parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects, such as residential buildings, the schools and hospitals, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants, or which cause disproportionate harm to civilians, I repeat. Serious violations, including war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, come under a special legal category known as international criminal law. All states have an obligation to bring those reasonably suspected of criminal responsibility for crimes under international law to trial, including through universal jurisdiction, but many states are either unwilling or unable to bring perpetrators to justice. The international community has established ad hoc tribunals to hold perpetrators to account for such violations in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. In 2002, the International Criminal Court (ICC) was established to end impunity for crimes under international law. There are 124 states parties to the ICC's founding document, the Rome Statute, that are subject to the court's jurisdiction. The ICC is a court of last resort used when national justice systems are unable or unwilling to bring perpetrators to justice. Cases can be referred to the ICC by the states or by a state party or by the United Nations Security Council, which can also refer cases against non-state parties. The ICC prosecutor can also decide to open an investigation against a state's party based on external evidence. Some states have established hybrid courts, which are domestic courts with international elements to hold perpetrators of crimes under international law to account. The ICC's first conviction in March 2012 was against Thomas Lubanga, the leader of an armed group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is still at war. Tribal issues are still happening there. Okay, so we have seen why it's important to understand what Amnesty International stands for. What are the duties in which conflicts they participate, and why it's important for us, for the country, and for the world to understand why Amnesty International is all about. Amnesty International have also been accused of being manipulated by the power of their donors in order to benefit some or other results in their investigations and research, which is the case that President Volodymyr Zelensky, NATO, Canada, and others have said about the last report of August 4th, 2022 of Amnesty International, accusing it of being misled or wrong in their assertions of what is going on in the war in Ukraine. You just heard what I just read, that it is the responsibility of the countries within the country, if it's an internal conflict or if it includes different countries, 2 or more countries. I have read this document more than one time, so for you to remember that even the countries that are in conflict, in this case Ukraine and Russia, have the responsibility to alert their civilians and to not put in danger the civilians by putting weaponry, by putting armament in the middle of a war zone, to keep schools, stadiums, public areas protected, or in order to attack the other country, to look for areas that are abandoned, already evacuated, or that are not going to represent any risk to civilians. That's what the document said. Why do I consider that it's important that we understand this, fellow Canadians? And speaking Europeans, NATO countries, and European citizens, New Zealanders, Australians, and the people in the UK, because on this document that you're going to go pay attention to, Volodymyr Zelensky came on television just recently, a week or 2 weeks ago, in response of Amnesty International investigations and research. As you have heard, these people are very responsible. They are not inventing like in the mainstream media, lying all the time. No, these guys go to the front lines, investigate, do research, take testimony from the people affected, family members that have survived the attacks, witnesses, etc. And of course, proof of the crime committed when necessary, like it's the case of Colombia, for example, and the 6,042 assassinated by the government of Álvaro Uribe Vélez and his citizen security program. Okay. After the Amnesty International document was released on August 4th, 2022, and the protest of Volodymyr Zelensky, which is supported by the United States, of course, and the United Kingdom, France, and the European countries, and NATO. This is the response to Amnesty International document. Respond to Amnesty International document of August 4, 2022. Response to Amnesty International, August 4, 2022. Press release. Amnesty International Canadian section, English speaking, acknowledges and deeply regrets the hurt, anger, and disappointment caused to our Ukrainian colleagues, the Ukrainian community at large, members and supporters across Canada following the August 4 press release on research conducted on Russia's strikes between April and July 2022. In every conflict situation, Amnesty's primary focus is the protection of human rights and civilians, particularly those most vulnerable and at risk. Although this was the intention of the research and extended press release, Amnesty International failed on several fronts, so says the Canadian response to Amnesty International on August 4, 2022. And the Canadian Amnesty International Canadian section continues. We regret the insufficient context and legal analysis, particularly given the nature of Russian aggression. These findings were not communicated with the sensitivity, responsibility, and precision required and expected of Amnesty, says Amnesty International, that it was not on the ground covering the Russian and Ukraine conflict. We recognize the magnitude and impact of these failings from an institution of our stature, particularly in the times of conflict. The manner in which the International Secretariat conducted this work, engaged with sections internally, and publicly communicated these findings resulted in creating the opposite effect and challenged our core principle of impartiality. We also regret the International Secretariat's subsequent communication and response to public and legal critique. It would be great if they make the documents public, but they didn't. Okay. We condemn Russia's instrumentalization of the press release to justify its legal aggression. Since the start of the invasion in February, Amnesty International has and continues to categorically condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an unjustified act of aggression and a grave violation of international law. Our commitment to investigate the Russian military aggression and war crimes against the Ukrainian people is reflected in the extensive research conducted since the beginning of the invasion in February. Amnesty has documented war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine in nearly 24 outputs, ranging from press releases to a 72-page report. That is true. But this document is failing to mention, as you will see, that Amnesty International has accused Russia more than 24 times, actually, regarding war crimes against Ukraine. Back to the document. As a section firmly committed to an equitable and decolonized approach to human rights, we greatly regret the deficiency in the collaboration between our International Secretariat and our AI Ukraine colleagues, which resulted in the resignation of Amnesty Ukraine's director. A decolonial approach begins with the principle to do no harm and centering those we are privileged to work with, particularly when they are most impacted and when they tell us that they are in harm's way. How we work is as important as what we work on, and in this case our ways of working from an equity-informed perspective fell unacceptably short, says the Canadian Amnesty International section. Several years ago, Amnesty International purposely decentralized to better listen, respond to, and be led the voices by the voices of human rights defenders on the front lines. Unfortunately, this press release defaulted to outdated ways of working, then centralized knowledge and decision-making while placing local expertise and understanding at the margins. We have done this at considerable risk to our colleagues and rights holders in Ukraine, says the document. Holding ourselves accountable requires a comprehensive and independent review of the internal process that brought us to this place, resolute steps to act on those learnings, and doing the hard work to rebuild the trust of our colleagues, partners, members, donors, and supporters. We are actively engaged with our International Secretariat to ensure local knowledge and expertise guide our future work, and will continue to advocate for the, I quote, nothing for us without us, unquote, principle in human rights advocacy. Important discussions, including plans for a thorough internal review, are currently underway, and Amnesty International Canadian section, English speaking, is committed to ensuring they lead to significant and more equitable changes in how Amnesty works globally. We express our solidarity to our Amnesty Ukraine colleagues, human rights defenders, and civilians who remain at great risk in Ukraine. Again, this is to respond to Amnesty International document published on August 4, 2022 on a press release. I see some issues here in this document. Unfortunately, this press release defaulted to outdated ways of working that centralize knowledge and decision making while placing local expertise and understanding at the margins, which is not what you're going to see in the original document. We have done this at considerable risk to our colleagues and rights holders in the Ukraine. Okay. What you're going to hear now is the document of Amnesty International document published on August 4, 2022, which contradicts precisely this paragraph, that unfortunately this press release defaulted to outdated ways of working that centralize knowledge and decision making while placing local expertise and understanding at the margins. You will be the judge of this. So as you said, you're here on this document of Canada Amnesty International chapter or section, let's say, Canadian section, English version, is an attack on the original document that you're going to listen. Amnesty International, August 4, 2022, Ukraine, : Ukrainian fighting tactics endanger civilians. As you hear in the beginning of the Amnesty International document itself, what it stands for, what is it that it stands for, especially in conflict zones, in war conflicts, armament, etc., is exactly that. They are there to find out the truth by taking witnesses and minimize the suffering and to protect the civilian population and those former combatants. The IHL demands that parties to a conflict distinguish between civilians who are afforded protection and combatants who are legitimate targets of attack. Civilians may not be deliberately targeted, although they may still be killed or injured if this happens as part of a proportionate attack on a military target. All parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects, such as residential buildings, schools, and hospitals, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants on which cause disproportionate harm to civilians. This is part of the IHL. As you know, the IHL is the international humanitarian law that is internationally approved, but by hundreds of countries that are part of the United Nations and of course part of the Security Council. We are talking about that there are 124 state parties to the International Criminal Court, which are the segments that I just read before regarding finding accountability for people responsible for crimes against humanity. This is the document. So if you pay attention to what I just read, it is their responsibility of the states at war to avoid the people to be targeted. All parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects, such as residential buildings, schools, and hospitals, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants or which cause disproportionate harms to civilians. Ukrainian fighting tactics endanger civilians. Firstly, military bases set up in residential areas, including schools and hospitals. Secondly, attacks launched from populated civilian areas. And thirdly, such violations in no way justify Russia's indiscriminate attacks, which have killed and injured countless civilians. Of course. Ukrainian forces have put civilians in harm's way by establishing bases and operating weapon systems in populated residential areas, including in schools and hospitals, as they repelled the Russian invasion that began in February. Amnesty International said today, such tactics violate international humanitarian law and endanger civilians as they turn civilian objects into military targets. The ensuing Russian strikes in populated areas have killed civilians and destroyed civilian infrastructure. I quote, this is Amnesty International, we have documented a pattern of Ukrainian forces putting civilians at risk and violating the laws of war when they operate in populated areas, unquote, said Agnes Kalmart, Amnesty International's Secretary General. I quote, being in a defensive position does not exempt the Ukrainian military from respecting international humanitarian law, she added. Not every Russian attack documented by Amnesty International followed this pattern, however. In certain other locations in which Amnesty International concluded that Russia had committed war crimes, including in some areas of the city of Kharkiv, the organization did not find evidence of Ukrainian forces located in the civilian areas unlawfully targeted by the Russian military. One critique against Russia. Between April and July, Amnesty International researchers spent several weeks investigating Russian strikes in the Kharkiv, Donbass, and Mykolaiv regions. The organization inspected strike sites, interviewed survivors, witnesses and relatives of victims of attacks, and carried out remote sensing and weapons analyses. Through these investigations, researchers found evidence of Ukrainian forces launching strikes from within populated residential areas, as well as basing themselves in civilian buildings in 19 towns and villages in the regions. The organization's Crisis Evidence Lab has analyzed satellite imagery to further corroborate some of these incidents. Most residential areas where soldiers located themselves were kilometers away from front lines. Viable alternatives were available that would not endanger civilians, such as military bases or densely wooded areas nearby or other structures further away from residential areas. In the case it documented, Amnesty International is not aware that the Ukrainian military who located themselves in civilian structures in residential areas asked or assisted civilians to evacuate nearby buildings, a failure to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians, as we read before. All parties to the conflict must take measures to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects, such as residential buildings, schools and hospitals, and must not carry out attacks that fail to distinguish between civilians and combatants on which cause disproportionate harm to civilians. It's the principle of the IHL. So, again, Amnesty International is not aware that the Ukrainian military who located themselves in civilian structures in residential areas asked or assisted civilians to evacuate nearby buildings, a failure to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians. Secondly, launching strikes from populated civilian areas. survivors and witnesses of Russian strikes in the Donbass, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv regions told Amnesty International researchers that the Ukrainian military had been operating near their homes around the time of the strikes, exposing the areas to retaliatory fire from Russian forces. Amnesty International researchers witnessed such conduct in numerous locations. International humanitarian law requires all parties to a conflict to avoid locating to the maximum extent feasible military objectives within or near densely populated areas. Other obligations to protect civilians from the effects of attacks include removing civilians from the vicinity of military objectives and giving effective warning of attacks that may affect the civilian population. The mother of a 50-year-old man killed in a rocket attack on June 10 in a village south of Mykolaiv told Amnesty International, and I quote, "The military were staying in a house next to our home, and my son often took food to the soldiers. I begged him several times to stay away from there because I was afraid for his safety. That afternoon, when the strike happened, my son was in the courtyard of our home, and I was in the house. He was killed on the spot. His body was ripped to shreds. Our home was partially destroyed," unquote. Amnesty International researchers found military equipment and uniforms at the house next door. Mykola, who lives in a tower block in a neighborhood of Lysychansk, Donbass, in the Donbass area, that was repeatedly struck by Russian attacks, which killed at least one older man, told Amnesty International, and I quote, "I don't understand why our military is firing from the cities and not from the field," unquote. Another resident, a 50-year-old man, said, I quote, "There is definitely military activity in the neighborhood. When there is outgoing fire, we hear incoming fire afterwards," unquote. Amnesty International researchers witnessed soldiers using a residential building some 20 meters from the entrance of the underground shelter used by the residents where the older man was killed. In one town in Donbass, on 6 May, Russian forces used widely banned and inherently indiscriminate cluster munitions over a neighborhood of mostly single or two-story homes where Ukrainian forces were operating artillery. I'm not for the killing of innocent people, that's why I'm reading this. In one town in Donbass on 6 May, Russian forces used widely banned and inherently indiscriminate cluster munitions over the neighborhood of mostly single or two-story homes where Ukrainian forces were operating artillery. Shrapnel damaged the walls of the house where Anna, 70 years old, lives with her son and 95-year-old mother. Anna said, and I quote, "Shrapnel flew through the doors. I was inside. The Ukrainian artillery was near my field. The soldiers were behind the field, behind the house. I saw them coming in and out. Since the war started, my mother is paralyzed. The soldiers were behind the field, behind the house. I saw them coming in and out since the war started. My mother is paralyzed, so I couldn't flee," unquote. In early July, a farm worker was injured when Russian forces struck an agricultural warehouse in the Mykolaiv area. Hours after the strike, Amnesty International researchers witnessed the presence of Ukrainian military personnel and vehicles in the grain storage area, and witnesses confirmed that the military had been using the warehouse located across the road from a farm where civilians are living and working. While Amnesty International researchers were examining damage to residential and adjacent public buildings in Kharkiv and in villages in Donbass and east of Mykolaiv, they heard outgoing fire from Ukrainian military positions nearby. This is a testimony for the Amnesty International researchers, hearing what was going on. In Bakhmut, several residents told Amnesty International that the Ukrainian military had been using a building barely 20 meters across the street from a residential high-rise building. On 18 May, a Russian missile struck the front of the building, partly destroying five apartments and damaging nearby buildings. Katerina, a resident who survived the strike, said, and I quote, "I didn't understand what happened. There were broken windows and a lot of dust in my home. I stayed here because my mother didn't want to leave. She has health problems," unquote. 3 residents told Amnesty International that before the strike, Ukrainian forces had been using a building across the street from the bombed building, and that 2 military trucks were parked in front of another house that was damaged when the missile hit. Amnesty International researchers found signs of military presence in and outside the building, including sandbags and black plastic sheets covering the windows, as well as new United States-made trauma first aid equipment. I quote, "We have no say in what the military does, but we pay the price," unquote, a resident whose home was also damaged in the strike told Amnesty International. Military bases and hospitals. We have heard all the time how Russia kills and destroys military hospitals and bases. Let's clear this up. Military bases in hospitals. In hospitals. Amnesty International researchers witnessed Ukrainian forces using hospitals as de facto military bases in 5 locations, in 2 towns. Dozens of soldiers were resting, milling about, and eating meals in hospitals. In another town, soldiers were firing from near the hospital. A Russian airstrike on 28 April injured 2 employees at a medical laboratory in a suburb of Kharkiv after Ukrainian forces had set up a base in the compound. Using hospitals for military purposes is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. IHL. Fourthly, military bases in schools. The Ukrainian military has routinely set up bases in schools in towns and villages in Donbass and in the Mykolaiv area. Schools have been temporarily closed to students since the conflict began, but in most cases the buildings were located close to populated civilian neighborhoods. At 22 out of 29 schools visited, Amnesty International researchers either found soldiers using the premises or found evidence of current or prior military activity, including the presence of military fatigues, discarded munitions, army ration packets, and military vehicles. Russian forces struck many of the schools used by Ukrainian forces. In at least 3 towns, after Russian bombardment of the schools, Ukrainian soldiers moved to other schools nearby, putting the surrounding neighborhoods at risk of similar attacks. That's against international law. In a town east of Odessa, Amnesty International witnessed a broad pattern of Ukrainian soldiers using civilian areas for lodging and as station areas, including basing armored vehicles under trees in purely residential neighborhoods, and using 2 schools located in the densely populated residential areas. Russian strikes near the schools killed and injured several civilians between April and late June, including a child and an older woman killed in a rocket attack on their home on 28 June. In Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces were using a university building as a base when a Russian strike hit on 21st May, reportedly killing 7 soldiers. The university is adjacent to a high-rise residential building which was damaged in the strike, alongside other civilian homes roughly 50 meters away. Amnesty International researchers found the remains of a military vehicle in the courtyard of the bombed university building. International humanitarian law does not specifically ban parties to a conflict from basing themselves in schools that are not in session. However, militaries have an obligation to avoid using schools that are near houses or apartment buildings full of civilians, putting these lives at risk unless there is a compelling military need. If they do so, they should warn civilians and, if it's necessary, help them evacuate. This did not happen to have happened in the cases examined by Amnesty International. Armed conflicts seriously hamper children's right to education, and military use of schools can result in destruction that further deprive children of this right once the war ends. Ukraine is one of the 114 countries that have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. I repeat, Ukraine is one of the 114 countries that have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, an agreement to protect education amid armed conflict, which allows parties to make use of abandoned or evacuated schools only where there is no viable alternative. Only when there is no viable alternative. Fifthly, indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces. Okay, so this is another critic against Russia. I don't see why the Canadian sector English version has to attack this document. Indiscriminate attacks by Russian forces. Many of the Russian strikes that Amnesty International documented in recent months were carried out with inherently indiscriminate weapons, including international banned cluster munitions, or with other explosive weapons with wide areas effects. Many of the Russian strikes that Amnesty International documented in recent months were carried out with inherently indiscriminate weapons, including internationally banned cluster munitions, or with other explosive weapons with wide area effects. Others use guided weapons with varying levels of accuracy. In some cases, the weapons were precise enough to target specific objects. The Ukrainian military's practice of locating military objectives within populated areas does not in any way justify indiscriminate Russian attacks. All parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects and take all feasible precautions, including in choice of weapons, to minimize civilian harm. Indiscriminate attacks which kill or injure civilians or damage civilian objects are war crimes. I quote, "The Ukrainian government should immediately ensure that it locates its forces away from populated areas or should evacuate civilians from areas where the military is operating. Militaries should never use hospitals to engage in warfare and should only use a school or civilian home as a last resort when there are no viable alternatives," unquote, says Agnes Kalmard. Amnesty International contacted the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense with the findings of their research on 29 July 2022. At the time of publication, they had not yet responded. But the Canadian response to Amnesty International press release, Amnesty International Canadian section, says that this is not true, that is a mistake, that was not using several years ago. Amnesty International purposely decentralized to better listen, respond to, and be led by the voices of human rights defenders on the front lines. Unfortunately, says the Canadian sector, unfortunately, this press release defaulted, the one that I just read. Unfortunately, this press release defaulted to outdated ways of working that centralize knowledge and decision making while placing local expertise and understanding at the margins. We have done this at a considerable risk to our colleagues and rights holders in Ukraine. Okay, let me clear this for you, audience. I am against the war. Everybody is against the war. Not everybody, except the guys that are profiting for them, except for Volodymyr Zelensky and whomever is behind this, which we all know is the United States of America, Europe, and of course the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson's Prime Ministry, of course Canadian Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and the Liberal Party, as well as 28 countries, now 30 countries, maybe 32 with Finland and Sweden, that are trying to join in the NATO forces. But there's something that I have to make clear. I come from a country that was at war for 62 years, if not more. It lasted till the last elections, hopefully, August the 7th, 2022. We know about war. We know about abuses of power. We know about corruption, big time. And I, as a Canadian citizen, don't want Canada to incur, to support, to provide weaponry and money to countries that are visibly corrupt, that the mainstream media in Canada and all around the world published before the 24th February 2022, publicly all around the world, how corrupt Ukraine was. As a country, as politicians are, and the presence of neo-Nazi covered by Canadian media before. Now, all of a sudden, with the United Nations, with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, with NATO allies, guided by United States, England, with this campaign of disinformation and misinformation, like John Pilger said just recently, this is a war of propaganda. This is a propaganda war, the war between Ukraine and Russia. I am not for war. I have witnessed that. Any person that have lived in Colombia and for the last 64 years will know that what is to be at war. The corruption of the country, etc., how institutions are corrupted by the power of capital, and a country with 7 military bases of the Americans, etc. We don't want that for Canada. We don't want that for Ukraine. We don't want that for any country in Europe. We don't want that for the United States. But when I see, and people like us, the country and the world that are responsible with media, that have witnessed a lot of disasters around the world, and watching this one, we have the responsibility to find out what and which is the truth. And this is the purpose of this program. In my understanding, after I have read for you Canadians and English-speaking people all around the world, NATO, Australia, UK, New Zealand, the Western world, how we are being manipulated by the power of lobbying of the special interests. Of course, are the production of weaponry. Saudi Arabia just bought billions of dollars in weaponry from England, the United States, and Canada. One of the most corrupt countries in the world when it comes to human rights issues, which Amnesty International defends all around the world. I don't agree with the Canadian sector saying that this document is to be retracted. On the contrary, it is my duty as a citizen of the world to read for you this document so that you are aware what the Amnesty International visitors and members witnessed and gained from the witnesses there, the people that survived the attacks, the victims of the attacks, etc. Like I said, Amnesty International have been openly criticizing Russia's attack, which makes, of course, others believe that Amnesty International might be receiving donation from special interests that profit from war. And that is because of the result of this war has taken over the Ukrainian people. Especially, like Nancy Pelosi says, we will help you till the end. That is, we will fight and give you, not for you, but we will give you the resources so you can die till the last Ukrainian. It's all right. Canada is supporting you, NATO is supporting you till the last Ukrainian. We have sent special forces, we have sent ammunition, we have sent billions of dollars, I believe 78 billions. I have that information for you more accurately, maybe in my next video. But the point is, Europe is losing their... what happened with Europe? I don't understand what happened with Europe. I don't understand what is happening here in Canada with this conservative and Liberal Party in the head of Mr. Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. But of course I do understand, and is the beast of gross capital, which profits from war, which profits from the pandemic, which profits from unscientific imposition of the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, and many others, that TLCs, and the structural result, the daughter and the son of the 40 years of neoliberal policy all around the world. But the corruption of the institutions that we have witnessed all in the world, especially here in Canada, which we began the movement, and now being accused of terrorists, especially now that Chrystia Freeland was insulted by a citizen. He has the right to say traitor. Yeah, he believes that she's a traitor. He has the right to say it. And it's being used now for the Prime Minister to accuse Canadians that disagree with such visible failures and like the mandates and the imposition to university students to be vaccinated, proven wrong, that immunity, natural immunity, is even more safer, as I have mentioned and proven with doctors and testimonies in my last programs, that these people are lying to us openly. The power of capital is taking institutions, universities that have demonstrated and documented that, so I couldn't wait to tell you Canadians, Europeans, that we need to resolve these issues. Otherwise, the brute capital is going to take over, and we cannot let that happen. Terrorism is going to come to Canada in the hands of the people that are interested and the weapon industry to keep creating wars all around the world. And that is why the West is losing ground all over the world. Their policies, their foreign policies, they don't have anybody to represent their ideological war against civilization. Because this minority group that are the 1%ers as denounced by Bandana Shiva and many others that does not comply with what the United Nations in the head of this Mr. Gutierrez, how can he say that this document is a failure of Amnesty International? These institutions, the World Health Organization, the conflict of interest of the United Nations, not paying attention to the realities of the documents we have read here in REACT today as part of the World Whale Project initiative, is to believe that the peoples in the world are idiots. And not only that, they are taking away the power of the citizens to vote, and are handling Canada, Europe, and the Western world as a corporate industry, where the citizens have no say, and they don't respond to us, to the citizenry. These people have never been voted for, and they're making the decisions for us, for the country, and for the world. This is unacceptable. If we, the people, don't take over, these idiots are going to bring war home, and are going to literally start a third world war. The point is, to finish, guys, that Europe is begging, is going to have to beg Russia for energy, because Europe doesn't have energy for this winter. But they insist on war instead of, as the documents in their own words, on February 4th this year, invited the United States and Europe to have confidence, and that Russia and China will participate in United Nations, will participate in the development of a civilization, in commerce, in trade, in technology, in aerospace technology, in everything. You heard it. I read it for you, Canadians and Europeans. And what was the answer of Antony Blinken? We will not accept anything that Russia said, as always have done for the last 25, 30, since 1994. And of course, since the promise of made to Gorbachev when they said they will not expand NATO. Now there's 32 countries against Russia, and all of them need Russia energy. Canada was not able to help Europe the way, or Germany the way they want it, or any other country. They're going to have to rely on Russia. They're going to have to eat their words. And not only that, the chaos that since the pandemic, and now with the war in Ukraine, that has caused inflation to Canadians, to Americans, to Europeans, is being justified with Russia. Russia is to blame. Only Russia is to blame. Listen, you politicians in charge right now, we the people all around the world are not that stupid, and we want you out of power. You're gonna take us to the end of times sooner than even God planned. This is a very serious issue. It's not fun. I'm not for war, and because I want to avoid it, and the documents show that this war was avoidable, could have been averted, shows the corruption of the politicians and their greed for big money, disregarding billions and billions of people, including in the first world countries, which are supposed to be transparent, with way less corruption, and of course caring for their peoples. If you have read this book, you will anticipate 2014. Buy it, get it on Amazon. In gold we trust. In gold we trust our path to eternity. You will understand why I'm so serious about this matter. Canadian people, we have to react today peacefully but effectively, demanding whatever mechanism is necessary in the Constitution, or to include it in the Constitution, to stop these demented ideas based on lies that have taken over the institutions, the universities, the think tanks all around the world, but here in Canada. For us, for the country, for the world, so much to say about it. What is your opinion? If you like what I just said, support the channel. I need a sponsor, guys. I'm out of work. I need some sponsorship. I need some income here. I'm a Canadian, and I'm living on the government, and I hate that. This is what I do best. Support my channel. Let me make a living the way I want it to. That's why a democracy and a monarchical constitution is all about. But apparently, whomever opposes this dictatorial censorship in Canada, who just 2 years ago was one of the best countries in the world, democratic and free, is become, in the words of George Galloway,
fascism, Hitlerism, Hitler fascism was by far and away the most important task facing humanity. And as you rightly just said, who played the decisive role in smashing Hitler fascism and the fascist axis of Italy, Japan and Germany with minor satellites like some of our best friends today, like Romania, like Bulgaria, like Hungary. It was the then Soviet Union, now Russia, that smashed Hitler fascism. Now we're supposed to love Germany and hate Russia. Go figure, Stephen. Thanks for the call. Let's go to Canada and talk with Robert about Russia. Go ahead, Robert.
Thanks, George. Just like to back you up on all the truth that you're telling. We get so much mistruth here in Canada. We're silenced out here. They say it's a democratic country and we can speak out, but we can't. We've got this Prime Minister. He attacks whistleblowers. He fired the Attorney General. So I appreciate you getting the truth out to Canadians. There's a lot of Canadians that back Russia, and I'm one of them. If you look at Russia, they've been invaded by the West. You can go back to when Sweden attacked through St. Petersburg, and Peter the Great kicked them out. Then you got the English going in and botching up Crimea. Then the English suck hole up to the French, and they go in with Napoleon. And then, of course, you got the two German World Wars. So now we've got the new one coming in. Now the English can't fight by themselves. What they have to do is they con people and they lie through the press. Dieppe and was one of them. New Zealand and Australia, they were slaughtered also because they had to do all the dirty work. So what I feel so bad about is these big Ukrainians are being tricked to do America's dirty work and make money for the U.S. and U.K. and French war machine. And this will continue.
Well, I think that's very powerful, Robert. Let me just tell you that on the day before yesterday, I visited the Canadian war graves in France, where the fallen in huge numbers, proportionately huge numbers, of Canadian soldiers who gave their lives on European soil. I have the greatest of respect for your country. I have toured it north, south, east and west. I've even spoken at a public rally in the Arctic Circle in Yellowknife in your country. I love Canada and Canadians, but I despise your Prime Minister with a vengeance that it is difficult for me to quite fathom. His hypocrisy is writ with a gigantic H. It is the biggest hypocrisy of them all. And I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde's famous report. The more they talked of their honor, the faster I counted the spoons. The more he talks about how liberal and democratic he and Canada now is, the more I count the freedoms and democracies and rights that he has stolen from the Canadian people, all in the name of liberalism. Robert, thanks very much indeed for that call.
This is really making me so furious right now. I mean, just what kind of a disgustingly dishonest and narcissistic government do we have in Canada? And you know, it just seems to get worse with each passing day. It looks like the political theatrics of the Trudeau Liberals never ends. And of course, it's typical of the Canadian federal government. Almost every public institution in Canada under this self-serving and vindictive Justin Trudeau Liberal administration is morally bankrupt and disgustingly corrupted already. Talk about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Public Health Agency, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and several others that have been engulfed in the corruption and grafts of the Trudeau Liberal administration. And it's just really saddening. And with the bullshit and false COVID narratives of the Liberals, the public trust that the majority of the people of Canada have, particularly in the so-called Health Canada and Public Health Agency, have been repeatedly shattered and frustrated by Justin Trudeau and the rest of his lying cabinet members. It's just really gross. I guess these so-called scientists are so scared to lose their pensions and cushy jobs that they would just do anything to float the Trudeau political science narratives. And when Canadians catch on to their lies and several hypocrisies, they try to whittle out like some disturbed worm in a hook, telling everyone that they've suddenly lost their memories and can't remember shit, or they weren't the ones who pushed the button. You know, they suddenly start covering up with shocking lies. It's just really disgusting and appalling of the so-called Health Canada professionals. Last month it was Brenda Lucki, and now it's Jennifer Little. And once again, it's more gaslighting and covering up from the Liberals. It would be interesting to know that, just as suspected, the travel mandates and restrictions imposed by Justin Trudeau and his fellow narcissistic Liberal guys were never about the health or the well-being of the people of Canada. They were about politics, illicit accumulation of wealth, control, and power grab by the Trudeau Liberal government. The rate at which there isn't single accountability in the supposed democratic system of the Liberal administration is just really alarming. This is really laughable, but at the same time, just tragic. Justin Trudeau is in Costa Rica for 2 weeks when the result of his now exposed narcissistic power grab had caused a lot of Canadians to lose their livelihoods, their relatives, and worse still, blocked from being allowed to visit their families or see them. It has always been suspicious that there was no science behind the unvaxxed travel ban like Trudeau had claimed. And at this point, it appears Trudeau won't want to take responsibility, and neither does the rest of his Liberal gang wish to take the coming shitstorm either. If, at this point, Health Canada is denying ever being responsible for issuing the travel mandates, then who exactly recommended it? Was it Justin Trudeau? And just why did Tam end up getting that humongous pay raise? What's going on with all these crazy and implausible denials? Well, stay around and watch this video till the end. We've got yet another of the Liberals' horrifying hypocrisy to reveal in today's video. And if today's your first time watching this channel, you're highly welcome to Front Page News, a channel dedicated to bringing you the latest news update without the ill-concealed and abundant hypocrisy of the left-wing and mainstream media. Please subscribe to the channel and assist in reaching more people by sharing this video and our other videos. Also, give thumbs up and drop your opinion in the comment section below. That said, let's quickly continue. In a rather shocking and unbelievable manner, court documents reveal Director General of COVID Recovery at Transport Canada, Jennifer Little, who reportedly wrote the policy that hindered unvaccinated Canadians from flying or traveling by train, said she has no memory of health officials recommending a vaccine mandate for travel. Little made the comments during a cross-examination under oath in federal court as a government witness in support of the mandate earlier in June. When asked if she was aware whether the Public Health Agency of Canada or Health Canada had recommended a mandatory vaccination policy for travelers, Little replied that she doesn't remember if there was any direct recommendation. In her words, "Certainly, we worked very closely with them in preparing the policy, which was supported by the government. So in terms of a written recommendation, for example, no. But as part of the policy-making process and the decision-making supporting process, certainly, we were working very closely with our health colleagues." Little had mentioned that she and her team started working on the travel restrictions policy in late July after the Trudeau Liberal government decided to impose the mandate, which was later announced on August 13. And while she was asked if there had been a recommendation from Public Health Agency Canada or Health Canada, or whether she even had any emails, briefs, or reports from them recommending mandatory vaccination for travelers, Little still doubled down on her narrative of not recollecting anything like that. Again, she said, "I do not recall a document from the Public Health Agency of Health Canada to Transport Canada recommending that Transport Canada take this approach." And in what seems rather ridiculous at the same time, Little had stated that she and her team of just under 20 apparently do not have any scientific background, and therefore she usually adopted whatever data and information Public Health Agency Canada provided without any checking or questions. In her words, "It's not my responsibility to question or analyze the data that the experts on public health in this country provide me." Meanwhile, the court had equally questioned Dr. Eleni Galanis, Director General of the Center for Integrated Risk Assessment within the Public Health Agency. In her statement, Galanis had apparently assumed her role last year in December and had joined a group advising Dr. Theresa Tam every week. When Galanis was asked during the cross-examination what was said about vaccine mandates during those meetings, She had mentioned that it was usually around already made decisions or probably when things were planning to be changed. In her words, it usually is around what the decisions have been and when things are planning to be changed, so Dr. Tam would inform us that the decision has been made to do this, or if she's in preparation for meetings, where the lifting of these will be discussed and asks us for supporting information if required. Delanis was equally asked if she knew why the vaccine mandates were lifted a few days before her cross-examination, but had replied in the negative. Delanis stated that the lifting of the mandates was discussed with Dr. Tam's advisory group, although she noted that the decision had been made way earlier than the June 14 announcement. And at the same time, she mentioned that Tam didn't really give their group reasonable grounds for lifting the vaccine mandates and travel restrictions, and neither did Tam, not her advisory group, ever deliberate on or talk about the merits of the travel mandates either. And if you've been guessing that since the discussions on the mandates weren't ranked high on Health Canada's agenda, apparently, there's a high possibility that what the mandate was supposed to address, the risk of transmission of the virus in modes of transportation, wasn't either. Well, you guessed just right. Delanis had stated that the mandate issue was rarely discussed during meetings and that she couldn't remember if Tam or the group ever discussed transmissibility in travel since she joined on December 2021. In the same vein, when Dr. Lisa Waddell, who is in charge of reviewing the COVID-19 scientific literature being published on a regular basis and summarizing it for the consumption of interested government personnel, was asked if the Public Health Agency Canada's brief recommended vaccination as a requirement to travel by air, he said no. On the same issue, Celia Lorenko, Director General of the Biologic and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate within Health Canada's Health Products and Food Branch, which gives the final say on approving vaccines, also stated that she never advised, nor was she consulted on the issue of mandating the vaccines for travel or working in the public service and federally regulated sectors. Lorenko said the vaccines only remain in circulation because they provide protection against severe outcomes. I guess the picture is already clear by now. It's all evident that the mandates and travel restrictions were mostly nothing more than a political move by the power-hungry Justin Trudeau Liberal government and a conditioning tactic to grace their totalitarianism and self-serving selfish administration. It's typical of the Liberals. It's always the same narrative of forgetfulness or telling the public they lost their memory or other times deny any responsibility for their action. And at the end of the day, you eventually can't pinpoint one person among the Liberals to be liable and accountable to Canadians. It's just really disheartening and frustrating. You all will remember the Freedom Truckers convoy and how they drove to Ottawa to meet with Justin Trudeau to discuss these ridiculous travel mandates and restrictions that Health Canada now says they did not recommend. And in a rather sad and horrifying manner, Justin Trudeau and none of his cabinet members would meet with the convoy and would rather attack and malign them in every way possible. And when the investigation commenced on the true justification for the invocation of the Emergency Act, Justin Trudeau and his Liberal gangs had claimed that the police had recommended it, and like you know, the end of the story, the police department later came out to deny any involvement in pushing the invocation of the Emergency Act. Earlier last month, too, saw Brenda Lucki denying all allegations of pressuring the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officials in order to politicize the Nova Scotia mass murder tragedy to favor the Trudeau Liberals' firearm ban. She had claimed that she doesn't recall ever saying she had promised her bosses to do their dirty job. And here again, we are with the same narrative, and it just gets worse every day in Justin Trudeau's Canada. No recollection seems to be a handy way of getting out of straight answers by the Liberals. Apparently, no one knew anything. No one was responsible for decisions, and no one had a medical background. Is this some joke? It's just totally ridiculous. But of course, just as usual, there's a lot of covering up going on. And there's Jennifer Little busy making what I could call a really sickening statement that shows nothing but a disgusting lack of critical thinking. So she's telling us that she doesn't recall any document or instructions from the Public Health Agency that involves Transport Canada mandating travel restrictions, and neither does she remember much about how it came to pass that tyrannical mandates were imposed on Canadians. And what's more insane is the fact that having no scientific background is acceptable for the position of Director General in Justin Trudeau's Canada. You know, it just puts the whole public service in a controversial and compromising position. This would have been really laughable if it hadn't appeared just tragic and so annoying. Meanwhile, just like it happened during the Freedom Convoy investigation into the justification of the Emergencies Act and that of the Nova Scotia investigation allegations, the narcissistic hands of Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet members are most likely behind this again. You would recall that the travel mandates and restrictions have been repeatedly claimed by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his ministers to the advice of public health experts, and here we are seeing as almost every notable health expert in Canada continues to deny ever recommending such to the Liberal government. Apparently, one can only reasonably conclude that the mandate and travel restraint orders were given by Justin Trudeau's office. And the letter from his office to Aldeburgh further confirms that the mandate orders apparently were from the Prime Minister's office. Let's read this. To realize these objectives, I ask that you achieve results for Canadians by delivering the following commitments. Require that travelers on interprovincial trains, commercial flights, cruise ships, and other federally regulated vessels be vaccinated, and continue to work with the federally regulated transportation sector to ensure that COVID-19 vaccination is prioritized for those workers. Yeah, you read it just right there. Apparently, the mandates and travel restrictions were nothing more than a political move by the power-obsessed and selfish Trudeau Liberal government. Meanwhile, they continue to deny and lie their way out, messing with Canadians, trashing people's ability to make a living and be with their families, and then glibly declare it wasn't us, making the whole thing look like there's been some phantom entity behind the vaccine recommendations. Once again, the implausible denial and hypocrisy of Justin Trudeau is out for the whole world to see, and it just makes one wonder what exactly is in store for Canadians this winter now that Justin Trudeau and his entire self-serving and selfish lying Liberals appear to have completely lost their conscience. The people of Canada are watching the atrocities of Justin Trudeau, and it's only a matter of time now before his bullshits and hypocrisies are nipped in the bud. So that's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with as many people as possible and drop your opinion in the comments section below. See you in my next video. Thanks for watching.
You hear it by yourself. For us, for the country, for the world. Hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Real Project initiative. Au revoir. Bye bye. Hasta pronto.